Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
This is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 32. Alvin. The story of Ross Bagdasarian Sr., Liberty Records, Format Films, and The Alvin Show is out now. Order your hardback, paperback, or ebook copies today on Amazon or at bearmanormedia.com. A reminder that I am scheduled to be on Stu's show live on April 24th to discuss this book, and I also appeared recently on Phil Hall's online movie show to discuss it as well. I'm currently at work on the Total Television Scrapbook, and I'll give you more details about this in an upcoming episode. Our guest today worked as a librarian at the Albert and Temmy Latner Jewish Public Library of Toronto. He has been reading comic books since age 4, and in his spare time launched the Jewish Comics Bibliography, which eventually led to an exhibition on display called Zap Pow Oi. And here he is, Steve Bergson. Okay, so on the phone I have Steve Bergson. How are you today?
Great, how are you doing?
Fine. Don't know if I've ever spoken with you before, but you're definitely interested in comic books, so tell us about how you got interested in comic books.
Well, I've been reading them for a long time, since I was about 4. I think I really started reading them just because I like superheroes. But over time I started to read other kinds of comics too, and around the time I was in university, I was noticing some of the Jewish content in the comics.
Mm-hmm.
Mouse had won the Pulitzer Prize, and was making headlines and getting discussed in universities. I found out about Contract with God rather late, but I did discover that in my local library.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just more and more examples. And being Jewish myself, I thought it was interesting because I'd grown up reading comics that didn't seem to have any Jewish content at all, and all of a sudden it's right there out in front of me. And I thought, there are probably some other Jewish fanboys and fangirls that would also be interested in this. Maybe they're not as aware of this stuff as I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I compiled the bibliography, and I shared it with my Jewish librarian colleagues because I got my library degree and got involved with the Association of Jewish Libraries. I met other Judaica librarians, many of them Jewish themselves. And the project just seemed to get bigger and bigger and kind of snowball from there. What I thought would be a one-time email of a bibliography to the association because we had our own mailing list.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered I could turn that into a website, and that could regularly update the website to add more and more entries.
Mm-hmm.
And I went from just a website to a themed mailing list where other people were also discussing the topic and letting us know about their discoveries and conventions. If there were forms of conventions, panels,
Mm-hmm.
and that's still around, though not as active as it used to be. And then someone suggested I set up a blog, and I have the blog now. So between the old bibliography, the Yahoo forum, the blog, and then I got into publishing a little bit. I got into helping with museum exhibits.
Mm-hmm.
There's a museum exhibit currently now in Toronto until, I think they're trying to have it till the end of April, about the Jewish comics connection, with quite a few local Canadian examples, which is interesting because people are more familiar with the American examples than the Canadian ones. But living here, I have some awareness of things like the Jewish War Heroes comics that they published before the end of the Second World War.
Now, in your bibliography, I kind of took a quick look at it and everything. Do you just cover stories or creators that have shown to do something that, shows being Jewish, or is it just anything and everything? Because, my knowledge of, the history of comic books is like basically all the comic books companies, at least the U.S. ones, were founded by Jews, and all their fathers were tailors, and and you could look at that for Marvel, DC, Harvey, Archie, pretty much every one of them. So, I mean, is there an angle, or is it just anything Jewish? I'll put it that way.
Well, for myself, I'll read the books, in the Jewish creators, but I'm more interested myself in the Jewish content. Stories, regardless of whether the writer, the illustrator, publisher is Jewish, where they've decided to have Jewish characters and what they've done with those Jewish characters, where they've talked about Judaism even if they don't have Jewish characters. I remember Alan Moore for the Prometheus series, which I still haven't gotten around to reading, but there was a page I saw reproduced where one of the characters is showing the other characters this kind of what looks like a hopscotch diagram on the ground. But it's the symbols of Kabbalah, the 10 spheres, done as a kind of hopscotch pattern. And I don't think there was anyone Jewish in that issue, but they took it, Alan Moore, as he sometimes will do, just like took this religious concept and threw it into the story. And if you're Jewish, you recognize it right away, and if you're not, they just try to kind of explain it to the layperson. So.
Okay. And then do you cover, like, forgive me because I don't know everything off the top of my head, but, certain characters complete just because, they are considered, like example, in Fantastic Four, Ben Grimm as a Thing is considered like the personification of Jack Kirby in certain regards. So, I mean, would you cover all that just because he was Jewish, so the character's Jewish, so cover it all, or is it still have to have, like, something more than that as far as what you would cover in your bibliography or for a show or something like that?
Yeah, for my personal collection, I'm more interested in times when his Jewishness comes out. For instance, the wedding issue recently, they had the marriage under the chuppah. He was wearing the prayer shawl and the skull cap, and there was a rabbi marrying them. So there was a lot more Jewish content there than just the Thing has a brawl on Yancey Street. That's just, it's
right.
It may be based on the real life fights that Jack Kirby had when he was growing up Jewish, but it's and having fights between the Jews and Italians in his neighborhood, but there's no specifically Jewish content in that story, so it would be nice to, I'd read it anyways, but I wouldn't include my bibliography and discuss it, in my panels and books and such.
Yeah.
With those books I mentioned before, I was really, just intending to, originally discuss these and tell people about them, was excited about sharing what I learned, from reading comics myself. But at one point I thought, wouldn't it be kind of nice to bring some of these Jewish stories together in a collection, especially the shorter ones, which people kind of pass by. They don't notice them as much because they're just either a backup story or a few pages in the main story. And why not commission some people to do new adaptations of folk tales, for instance? So I kind of threw those ideas together. I ran it by a publisher who said, yeah, let's go with it. And now we've gotten 2 volumes published out of that in Canada.
What are the names of those? Is the same names as the show? Because I saw Zap Pow Oi, or is that just the name of the show?
That's the name of the exhibit.
Okay.
The anthology is called the Jewish Comics Anthology. The first volume is spelled with comics with an X.
Oh, okay.
And the second volume, we made that the subtitle, and the main title is SCI, because they're all science fiction adaptations.
Okay. And
science fiction stories, mostly adaptations.
So what's the difference between the first volume and the second volume? Just that, or?
One of the differences is the second volume is all sci-fi.
Okay, got it. Okay.
And all of the material in the second volume is new. It may be adapted from a lot of them are adapted from old stories, but it's all newly commissioned material.
Oh, okay.
And the first volume has reprints. We've got a reprint of a 2-page Golem story that was starting off one of the Strange Tales issues. Strange Tales 177. We have a 1-page Lilith issue, Lilith Origin. Not Lilith, the daughter of Dracula, just Lilith, the Jewish myth that they put into one of the vampire magazines.
Mm-hmm.
It's got all kinds. It's a whole mix of volume 1, which I like, and it covers different years. But, volume 2 is all like 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Volume 1, we had I think it came out in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look up what year it came out. But we had new material, but then we had material going all the way back to the 1940s. Joe Kubert did a golden story back then, which we managed to reprint.
Now, since it goes back that far, I assume your collecting knowledge and everything goes back to as far back as when comic books began, and maybe even before. I mean, was it harder? Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, it's a bit of a problem for me because I was only born in '69. Growing up, all the stuff I was buying new is stuff that came out in the '70s. So had to do a bit of research and spend a bit of money to get stuff that predates me.
Mm-hmm.
And the Golden Age stuff is hard to find. Some of it's a bit too much out of pocket for me to buy right now.
Right.
And going before the Golden Age, I mean, I'm aware of stuff like the David Kunzel strip. Well, the strips that David Kunzel mentions.
Mm-hmm.
Religious pamphlets that were in the form of comic strips, but I don't really go much past the 40s, and even in the 40s, I don't have that much awareness. I don't have that much in my personal collection, but I did get the Jewish war heroes. I did get Bible stories, picture stories from the Bible, Old Testament edition.
Right.
But I have the odd things from the 40s, but it's mostly, I guess, 1970s onward.
Mm-hmm. Which is fine. I was just kind of curious. My main question, though, is are there, other than biblical stories, are there a lot of Jewish stories, to your knowledge, as far back as the 40s? Or was it like kind of a hidden thing, like they might do something occasionally, but it wasn't really considered something you could do mainstream, let's say, back then?
I don't find a lot from the 1940s.
Okay.
And again, it could be, that's... I mean, one of my favorite sources to go to is the Grand Comics database, comics.org.
Right.
And they're kind of limited in how much they may show all the covers and tell you how many issues came out in a particular year, but as far as giving synopses of every single story, there's quite a backlog there, and a lack of knowledge on the part of the indexers too. So it's much easier to find out what they're publishing now. If the synopsis is not available on the website, people are discussing it on their blog. They're discussing it on an internet forum. It comes up when people discuss it at conventions. But to know all the details about the stories from the 1940s is hard. And I also think that even though you had a significant number of Jewish creators working in the comics industry at the time, they weren't interested so much in telling Jewish stories. Or if they were interested in trying to generalize it so much that unless you were Jewish and could read between the lines, you didn't see it as a Jewish story. It was just a generic story that everyone could enjoy.
Right.
And there's a marketing angle to that, too. It's easier to sell the generic stories, in theory, than the more specific stories because...
well, they want a mass audience, of course. They don't want to exclude anybody, but yeah. I forgot the name of the book. I think it's called Superman Was Jewish, ? And, so then you start thinking about that in that regard, and they go, well, how many of these characters, if you really thought of them in like a Jewish sense, would kind of explain things differently as to why they were created? Did you find that in various characters that you've read over the years that may not have been identified as Jewish, at least initially?
Well, when they're going back to the Golden Age, I think, using this, some of the Silver Age, quite a lot of times you'll find these academics are extrapolating when they don't have when they can't find the information in the interviews and the creators are long gone.
Mm-hmm.
They say, well, there's a likelihood that Superman was an archetype of Moses, but they'll never really know that because they can't introduce Siegel and Schuster, who may have actually been more influenced by stories of Hercules and Samson.
Right.
Samson being Jewish too, but I mean, Hercules, Atlas, all strong men.
Yeah.
In contemporary times, you can go to a convention, you can email the author, and you can ask them. Some of them are just upfront about saying, yes, I was inspired by this Jewish source to create this story. But other times it's guesswork.
Okay.
But talking about the generic stories again in mass audience, I think that the common wisdom of the publishers back then was, yes, sell the most generic stories you can, so that everyone can identify with the characters, everyone can identify with the situation. And I think the flip side you have now is that there's a significant number of people in today's audience who look back at those stories and say, well, they were kind of bland, and I would find it bland if they were coming up with the story today. I want particularism. I want to see Jewish and Muslim and Hindu characters. I want ones that are more colorful.
Right.
If I'm from a specific ethnic type, I want to see people that are like me. But I also want to see other ethnic types to see what their life is like, rather than just one everyman that no one can really identify with because their life is so bland that they can't relate to it.
Yeah, that's true. Did you find in all the research over the years, and you can even go from the 70s to the present, more like stereotyping or even just outright prejudice in a lot of the comic books versus, like, say, now? Or is it always been there or never been there?
Well, I mean, I think it's easier to see the stereotypes, unfortunately, with things like the representation of black people, African Americans.
Yeah.
I went to an exhibit where they had some old Wonder Woman, and there were all the negative physical stereotypes of black people in this, but they say you have to appreciate that it was created in a certain time period, and that's the way they were all drawn. But I was shocked. I didn't realize that these types of images were in some of my favorite were in comics with my favorite characters. But
yeah.
I didn't live through that period, so I'm looking at it with different eyes.
Right.
I think there's more negative stereotypes of Native American Indians, Aboriginal people, blacks, than there were of Jews. There probably were some, but I mean, I think it's hard to find because there weren't that many examples of Jews in the comics in the first place.
Right.
Explicit images of Jews.
Yeah. The only reason I say that is because I was watching recently the uncensored version of Disney's Three Little Pigs. Granted, it's an animated cartoon, but the wolf disguises himself as a Jewish Fuller Brushman, and then on the censored version, as it were, he just becomes a generic Fuller Brushman. But so in your studies, did you find anything like that? Is this like literally poking fun and drawing something with a stereotypical look, or stereotypical symbols or things like that, or was that kind of avoided completely back then in regards to Judaism?
I just haven't found it myself. I mean,
okay.
One of the going back to the 1950s.
Yeah.
I think some of the earliest depictions of Jews of that period, besides the biblical comics, would be the Classics Illustrated.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a Classics Illustrated adaptations of Ivanhoe, which had Isaac the Jew and his daughter Rebecca. There was Oliver Twist, which had Fagin the Jew, which eventually became an adaptation by Will Eisner, Fagin the Jew.
Yeah.
There was, I'm not sure if it's how much they adapted The Merchant of Venice. At some point it got adapted, maybe not during the 1950s.
Yeah.
But, in those Classics Illustrated adaptations, I don't think they were particularly using Jewish stereotypes. They were just using, as far as how the character appeared on the page in the story, they were just, adapting it straight from Dickens, straight from Walter C. Scott.
Mm-hmm. And I know as comics grew, as it were, they tended to put more true messages instead of hidden symbolism or anything. And the earliest examples I can think of is, and I can't think of story names, which, if I research further, I could have them at the top of my head. But, some of the EC stories, and like shock suspense stories and things like that. I remember, there were certain things about people being prejudiced against and things like that. And I believe it was about Judaism and things like that in some cases. Of course, Feldstein and Gaines were Jewish and wrote those stories.
There's a story, at least partially reprinted, on the walls of, we reprinted pages and hung them on one of the walls at Cedric, where that exhibit is, you mentioned, in Toronto, from a story called Hate.
Mm-hmm.
And that story involved an anti-Semite who likes basically antagonizing the Jews of his neighborhood along with his fellow anti-Semites, until he discovers that he was adopted, and we figure out it's discovered that his true parents were Jewish, so he's Jewish himself.
Right. Yeah, I remember that one.
He's not so keen on being anti-Semitic, and then his former friends turn against him.
Right.
There was that story. There's the classic Bernie Krigstein story, in Impact #1, Master Race.
Right.
That was influenced by Spiegelman when he did Mouse.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a story in, I think it was one of the issues of Psychiatry, which Bill Gaines talked about. The character ended up being not Jewish. They said when they originally wrote the story, he was definitely Jewish. And his being Jewish, factored into his personality, which was why he was having issues, which were addressed in the story. And then because of the Comics Code, they would say, well, take out all the Jewish references.
Right.
So they did, and then they said, we did it, and we published it, and it really doesn't make sense without all the Jewish references.
Wow. Hey, you're referring to psychoanalysis, right? That title? Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was psychoanalysis or psychiatrist or something like that.
It's called psychoanalysis. It's a very long title, but that's... But, yeah, I remember that one, too. I've read virtually everything EC put out, except maybe the earliest children's stuff or something. But, it is interesting that they had an EC show here in Eugene, Oregon 2 years ago, and it was fascinating looking at the original art on some of these, and it was from some of the stories you're talking about. Is that the type of stuff that's in your Zap How Oi show? What type of stuff did you have hanging in that show?
Well, it's in a way a combination of two shows. So one is just telling the history of comics, the history of the industry, and the Jewish creators behind them. So stuff about Donenfeld and Stan Lee, Julie Schwartz, stuff about the creators, and showing just some of the typical comics that they were publishing at the time. And then we get in more to the comics with Jewish content. Hereville, some of the modern graphic novels that have Jewish content. Fagin the Jew, like I mentioned earlier. We have reprints from what looks like the first concept that Eisner had for Fagin the Jew. It wasn't originally going to be a book. It was going to be some kind of TV treatment, but he made these storyboards. And so I was able to put the panels from the storyboards together to show how he kind of transformed that into the graphic novel. There's one section we have on Jewish Canadian content, Jewish Canadian creators. It's a small section because there's a lot less here in Canada than there is in the States, but we do have things like Northgard, whose image got on one of our stamps. It's recognized that way.
Wow.
There's, I don't know how much you know about Broadway these days. There's a show going on there now called Come From Away.
What's it called? I'm sorry?
Come From Away.
Oh, okay.
It's doing quite well there. One of its co-creators is a Canadian Jew, David Hine. So not only was at one point self-publishing these mini-comics to kind of promote himself, talk about his life, he later went on to do a backup story for a Spider-Man issue.
Wow.
Last year, I think.
So, let me see.
And another easy thing I want to mention is, I can't think of the name of the comic now, but one of the war issues was a story which revolved around a soldier who is different, but they never really explain, why he's different and how he's different. If you read between the lines, it seems like he's awfully Jewish. He's so he goes to services on Saturday instead of Sunday, and I think they may have made it reference to the fact he doesn't eat the same as they do, but they never go right out and say he is Jewish. But he's either Jewish-like or he is Jewish. But there's some of the clues there. I mean, Seventh-day Adventists also worship on Saturday instead of Sunday, and they have dietary rules too. So it could have been that, but.
So this was in either Frontline Combat or Two-Fisted Tales, one of those?
May have been Frontline Combat. I'd have to.
Okay. I think it is. That's why I said that one first, because I believe it is in that title, yeah. Is there anything, I guess, that kind of stands out that you really are looking for a good story to represent in either your books or in a show? What type of things do you look for?
Well, in Jewish books in general, and it applies to comics also. I don't like it to be tokenism.
Okay.
I don't like it to just be that. Hey, meet my friend here, Ira Goldberg, and okay, now we know that he's your friend and that he's Jewish, and then nothing about his Jewish identity is shown the rest of the whole issue or the rest of the series. It's just we all know he's Jewish.
Right.
We all know this guy's person, but how does that affect his life, and how does that affect the story or anything? It's just a guy who's there just to say we have a Jew in this issue. It doesn't do much.
Okay.
Or if he's, if it's a holiday issue and they have him lighting a menorah and then nothing else happens, it's like, Jews do more than just, say, hey, I'm this token Jew, or light the menorah, and that's
right.
it. There's other things to do.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit of a tricky thing with storytelling because we don't want. I've heard this from other librarians that I've worked with. We don't want every time they decide to have a Jewish character, it's got to be Holocaust. It's got to be anti-Semitism.
Right.
The Jew has to be the victim or potential victim because we're more than just victims or stand-in for victims.
Yeah.
The same way that you don't want a woman an issue to just be the damsel in distress. There's other things she does before she becomes the damsel in distress, and she may be tough enough and have enough courage that she's not the damsel in distress. She's actually the heroine. She's actually someone that fights the villain. Jews have other roles they can play in comics. They can play in stories besides being victim. Besides just being a token to show that you're multicultural.
But you don't turn
tell storyteller to use the characters right. Just like if they're going to introduce an Italian or they're going to introduce a Catholic or any other kind of type, we want well-rounded characters and well-rounded stories. There was one by this Jewish writer Rosenberg, Matt Rosenberg. He did this. I thought it was quite an interesting miniseries, which I collected as a trade paperback. It's like 4 kids walk into a bank, and one of those characters was Jewish, but it wasn't front and center. You knew he was Jewish. He wore a yarmulke. There was throwing some Yiddishisms from time to time, but he was an important part of the story without pointing to his Jewishness all the time.
Okay. And I assume, the ones you're describing are probably like the favorite types that you like to see, for good representations, and not the victim ones, even though you did mention earlier like Mouse or something, which does have the Holocaust in it in its own way, but I assume that's what you prefer, is not the non-Holocaust kind of one that just shows good representation of Judaism, correct?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorites is the Hearville series. There's 3 books out by Barry Deutsch, and the tagline is it's another story about an 11-year-old Orthodox Jewish girl who wants to fight dragons. I think that's how he put it.
Wow, I like that.
And, yeah, I mean, he's saying it tongue in cheek, but you don't see that.
Right.
And it's not just about dragons. It deals with relationships. She's got a kind of love-hate relationship with her stepmother, who she learns in the end, is able to instill in her, values and skills that she doesn't appreciate at first, but they come in handy later. But also, you have this whole kind of build-up to, is this where she's going to, seek out the troll and try to get the sword from him? And all of a sudden, it's Friday night, and on Friday night, everything stops, because that's what happens in Orthodox families is, whether it's, doing accounting or fighting trolls or, searching for, searching for coins in the sand in Florida, whatever it is, everything stops on Friday night. You do, you go to synagogue, you say the prayers, you rest, you do all these rituals, and then when Saturday night's over and you do the official, called the Havdalah ceremony, then you can go on with your life and, go into the forest and find the troll so you can try and get the sword from him. And it's like, it's not forced. It's just, this tale being told over, I guess it was 7 days, the Sabbath had to come in there. And it's probably interesting for the non-Jewish readers to come to this part and like, okay, it's a logical break in the story, and I get to learn something about this culture that I've not been exposed to much. Okay, now we're going back to stuff I understand. Talking pigs and trolls, swords and all that.
Now, with all this, I mean, obviously you focus on comic books, but have you ever planned, or do you ever plan to expand into other areas like movies, television, music, or anything else?
I'm interested in all the ways that Jews and Jewish ideas are represented. I go to Jewish film festivals. I go out to the movies, whether I'm intending to see a Jewish movie or not. Sometimes you have those aha moments when there's a Jewish reference you weren't expecting to see there, and like later you're processing it. Was that a good reference to have or not a bad reference? And why did they put that in there? One of my an odd moment I remember is seeing this this Kristen Slater movie around a wedding.
Oh, which one?
Very Bad Things, I think it's called. And there's a death that happens during the bachelor party, and they have to bury the body because they don't want to get involved in, don't want the police to fall in. And all of a sudden, the Jewish guy who's among them says, "Wait, we can't bury the parts like this. We have to bury them all together because it goes against my culture and my beliefs and everything. I'm going to have a breakdown or whatever if we don't do this properly." And then they have to dig up all the body parts and then put them all together.
Wow.
It was bizarre.
Wow.
It's bizarre, but I understood what the character was thinking. Kind of. Yeah.
Now, in your own background, are you totally devout, or were you raised that way, or did you have to kind of learn certain things over the years about how the Jewish culture is and things like that?
I was raised conservative, but I went to the school system here called... Hold on, man. Yes, okay, fine. Sorry, excuse me.
You can edit it out if you have to. Anyway.
Take two. So there's a school system here called Associated Hebrew Day Schools, and they're pretty good about teaching you a lot about Jewish culture and the Jewish religion. I think they're more traditional than I was in my own home. Some of the stuff you just pick up. I mean, in my professional career, I spent 9 years as a Judaica librarian, and you're surrounded by these Jewish texts and these books about Jewish texts, and you interact with some of your patrons. You know, they're trying to find something, and as much as you're trying to teach them where to find the information in the library, you're also learning the stuff yourself.
Right.
It's been an interesting, Jewish journey for me. I'm still working in a Jewish organization, but not with the kind of religious books I used to. And I meet people at panels and at comic conventions, so it's a learning process. And I have, my children are getting a Jewish education now, so I'm learning through them some of it too.
Do they actually go through
plays or help them with their presentations?
Do they actually attend Hebrew school? Do they go that far, or just you just keep them in the faith, as it were?
A different Hebrew school than I attended.
I see.
But, they're still learning the holidays. They're still learning the language.
And I assume you observe all the customs and everything as best as you possibly can. It's like you probably have them bar mitzvah and things like that, and Sabbath and all that. How devout are you in that regard? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I had a bar mitzvah. My children are going to have bar mitzvahs, and we have Friday night dinners.
I see.
But in Judaism, there's 613 laws.
Wow.
I know that Christians talk about the Ten Commandments. We have that too. We call them in Hebrew the Aseret Divrot, but those are 10 out of the 613. They're considered like the most important 10. But there's all these 603 other ones, which you don't have to follow them every day, but throughout the year there's 613 that come up, and I don't follow anywhere near that number, but I like to think I follow the important ones, and I'm aware of the other ones. And, given the way that my lifestyle is, my family's lifestyle is, we want to be respectful, and we want to observe certain traditions while not being able to maintain them all, as an Orthodox Jew would.
Right. Yeah. I have to confess, I was raised Christian, so, it's like, and I'm not Jewish, so it's like everything I've learned, I've either learned from friends or attending things, going to the movies, learning things by reading, things like that. So, I can't say I'm extraordinarily knowledgeable about the subject, but enough to get by. I mean, it's like that, I can talk about it and know, certain things and certain festivals, certain holidays, things like that,
I mean, and talking about the Orthodox, one of the impressions that I've gotten from years of research and reading is that there's not that much participation in the comics industry by the Orthodox, which doesn't mean that there's none at all.
Yeah.
But it's so little, and as a result of that, there's Orthodox people who work in comics who they'll work on Superman, they'll work on Wonder Woman. There's a guy, Neil Clyde, I know he worked on the story in an issue of Creepy. So they'll do the mainstream stuff. You don't always do stuff from your background, but at the same time, some of them, once in a while, they'll put out a book that's got Jewish content, or even Orthodox Jewish content. And some of that will, kind of filter, will be noticed and maybe remembered by their readers. If there's a Neil Clyde fan, they might pick up Brownsville just because they're a fan of his work, and then learn about the Jewish mafia, or pick up The Big Con and learn about a bit about the Orthodox Jewish world and get a sense of their attitudes because of that book.
Now, in all your comic book research and everything, are there any stories that you've heard about that you are trying to track down but just haven't because, you said like in the Grand Comics database, sometimes they don't have enough information that you just like to see or, read or something?
Are
you always looking for things, and what type of things are you looking for at this time?
Well, I mean, I've been maintaining a list, I don't think I have it published, but I've been maintaining a list of items I'm aware of that I just haven't, either I can't find or I'm not ready to purchase them yet.
Mm-hmm.
So that list keeps growing, and then I try to, check my items off the list if I go to the comic shop and have an opportunity to buy something.
Right.
Just reasonably. There's quite a long list of stuff which I would like to buy.
Mm-hmm.
Or stuff which I hear is coming out, and then I hope I can get a review copy, or that they'll sell it in a store. Next Saturday, there's going to be a panel at the Beit Avraham Yosef Toronto Synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be on the panel with Jordan Gorfinkel, who's going to be there to promote his Passover Haggadah graphic novel, which is. I got an advanced copy. It looks very interesting, very colorful. It can be used during the Passover Seder, but it also it's just very impressive to read. Jordan Garfinkel is, of course, one of the former Batman editors.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got his comics credentials, but he's also got his kind of Jewish comics credentials. He's got an ongoing syndicated comic strip called what does he call it now? I'll have to look that up.
Okay, that's fine.
It changed names.
We could say the old name.
It was once called Chosen People.
It was called. Yeah, I'd say you could say the old name. What was it?
I think it was called The Chosen People.
Okay.
If you look up Jewish Comics Gorfinkel, you'll find it.
Okay. That's the Google search for everybody out there listening.
I think it's got the URL jewishcartoon.org.
Okay. Part of the reason I was asking, go ahead.
It may be jewishcartoon.com.
Okay. All right. Part of the reason I was asking if there's any elusive ones or anything you were looking for is I bet, because I'm a Harvey Comics fan, so I've seen like every story, there's a couple Harvey things that you may or may not be aware of. And if you're aware of, hey, kudos to you. And unfortunately, Go ahead.
Sorry. The one Harvey that I do have is Little Dots, No Easter for Seth.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of them. Okay, so you do know about that one. Actually, is it Little Dot or Little Audrey? I thought it was Little Audrey, but yeah, you did find that one.
Maybe it's Little Audrey, but she's a friend of Little Dot, wasn't she? I get them mixed up sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's a Little Audrey story, but you got the title right. I know you had the right story. Yeah. And I believe Seth is Seth Jacobson, even though they never say it in the story, which one of the editors at Harvey was Sid Jacobson, and his son is named Seth. So that's where that came from, and I'm still good friends with Sid now. The other one is that in the late 80s, Harvey kind of split when the original owners got older or passed away, and all the children of the owners got the rights to the Harvey Comics company before they sold it. And one branch of the family decided to move back to, or not move back to, but move to Israel. And they actually produced a Casper comic that's in total Hebrew. And it's kind of hard to find, but I managed to get my hands on it, and it's like a coloring book, so it's not really a story, but it's just like their intention was to do Jewish Harvey comics, but they never really got off the ground beyond the one book, and I managed to get a copy through this online thing, and unfortunately it was the last copy. Otherwise, I'd refer you to them, called Oi Toys, and they just had one in their stock, and they sold it to me. So that's something to look out for if you're looking for bizarre or rare Harvey Jewish comics that actually are Jewish, So
yeah, I have seen the Casper. I just wasn't sure. I didn't have the background about it. But
Yeah. So you have seen those things, but it's very kind of interesting because although the Harveys were Jewish and their surname really was originally Wiernikov, they don't really discuss it much in any of their comics. I mean, if anything, Richie Rich and all the characters celebrate Christmas, but that seems to be across the board in a lot of comic books, that ho 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 and Santa, not necessarily Jesus Christ, just the the secular version of Christmas, as it were, But
yeah, well, I mean, in more recent years, they haven't given up on the idea that they want to show superheroes celebrating Christmas.
Yeah.
But they've expanded it to have Kwanzaa stories and Hanukkah stories in their holiday issues.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's the superhero holiday issues.
Yeah.
Just this last December, they had an X-Men holiday special, and it included Magneto. Some kind of Magneto Hanukkah, and they're really short ones. Like they had one for every day of the year, of the month, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there was Kitty Pryde in there lighting the menorah. There was Wolverine coming to the rescue of some family celebrating Hanukkah, something like that. So it's interesting.
And
then I remember now that John Gorfinkel syndicated comic.
Oh yeah.
It's called Everything is Relative.
Everything is relative. Okay. All right. So I'll have to look that up and check that out.
Possibly, yes. Everything's.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen other books out that other people put out. Like Craig Yo put out a book called We Spoke Out, and this is a Holocaust book. But did you participate and help out with those books and things like that?
I did help out with We Spoke Out. I met Raphael Medoff in person when he was telling me about working on the book.
Uh-huh.
I guess it was too late for me to get involved, because I would have been happy to be involved with that.
Okay.
But I reviewed it for the Association of Jewish Libraries. I gave it a positive review.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a lot of good stuff in it.
Yeah.
Doesn't have everything, but it's hard to include every story. The book just gets bigger and more expensive once you put out a second volume, maybe. But,
right.
he had some good choices in there.
Yeah. I do know that Craig Yo tends to like to put ones that he doesn't have to pay licensing fees and things like that, which is, no issue there.
That's probably one aspect of it, yeah.
Yeah. He likes the public domain stuff, which is certainly fine, because a lot of that stuff is hard to find, so, if he's reprinting it at all, I'm happy, even if it's, considered public domain, so.
Well, maybe something that Craig and I have in common is that we both like the idea of, not just sharing our knowledge of comics and giving it wide exposure, but trying to highlight the hard to find stuff. Because if it took years to even find out about, much less track it down and read it, how much less likely are other people to know about it? And if you can get it published, by a mainstream publisher now, so people can get their hands on it, then you've done kind of a this great thing of letting it have a second life.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said you've done some various panels. So, which panels have you done? And have you done comic shows around the country down here, or just in Canada, or both?
Well, some of the panels I've been on have been academic panels at the Association of Jewish Libraries conference.
Okay.
I did one non-Jewish. Sorry. I did one panel for the Popular Culture Association years ago. Did a panel at the American Library Association. Mm-hmm. So that one was more to do with the representation of librarians in comics than Jewish, because that was one of my sideline interests for a while. Kind of got overtaken by the representation of Jews in comics. Mm-hmm. I've been on a panel at New York Comic Con, San Diego Comic Con. I've done some panels at the Jewish Community Center here in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And now, I haven't been at New York Comic Con in years, but apparently for 2 years running, and they'll probably continue doing it, there's this group called there's a podcast called Nice Jewish Fangirls.
I think I've heard of that, yeah.
It's hosted by 3 Orthodox Jewish women who love, who are into fandom, not just comics. Mm-hmm. And they've been hosting panels at New York Comic Con. Packed room 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And have you been on their show?
Haven't been on their show yet, but I've had correspondence with some of them, and you don't. When they have these panels, you don't have to be Orthodox. You don't even have to be Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a fangirl. Everyone's invited to be in the audience, but the three people that are moderating it, that's what their background is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the lens they're looking at comics and popular culture through.
Mm-hmm. And when you've been on these various panels, are they usually about like what we're talking about, or do you talk about other things? How do the panels usually go for you?
I try to steer towards Jewish content in the comics. Sometimes it kind of swings the other way towards the Jewish creators.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of depends on who's invited and what they want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Two of my panels have been with Danny Fingeroth, who's a great speaker and a great organizer too, because he's now helps organize panels as well.
Mm-hmm.
I had Marv Wolfman on one of my panels. That was interesting because he's most associated with things like Tomb of Dracula, the new Teen Titans, but he also was asked to write this book called The Illustrated History of the State of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the story he told was that a guy working at one of the Jewish charities that was trying to put this book together, he'd come across his work on the history of the DC Universe, which came out around time of their 50th anniversary,
Mm-hmm.
in conjunction with the Crisis on Infinite Earths. And he liked the way he did that story so much. Mark said to him something like, "But you realize that I do fiction." He said, "I know you do fiction, but the style that you use to tell this fictional history can be applied to telling a true life history."
Mm-hmm.
So Marv decided to do the project, and it came out beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Now, just shifting over a little bit because you mentioned it. Sometimes you said a conversation switches over to Jewish creators, which there certainly are a lot. And I was just kind of thinking, there's no right or wrong. It's just your opinion. It's like, why do you think there are so many Jewish creators in comic books?
Well, the theory that usually gets thrown out, and I think certainly some validity to it, is that in a time when some of the Jewish artists have been impressed with the work they saw in comic strips on the newspaper page, wanted to break into the industry. They were basically shut out, and along came comic books, which had a similar format. Instead of being a single line, it's just like line after line of a continuing story.
Mm-hmm.
So they could do the comic art in an industry where not only were they not specifically shut out, there was easy entry because, well, two things. First of all, there were some Jewish publishers who weren't going to exclude other Jews from the industry.
Right.
But also they were looking for, this might not sound nice, they're looking for people that were desperate that they could take advantage of, because there were no. And they're also looking for cheap work. They didn't care that the work was not up to today's artistic and writing standards, because there were no standards to go by.
Right.
So if they could have a fast turnaround and get the comics on the shelves, they were lenient about how great your art had to be, how great your stories had to be. How much they had to make sense. So there were these just desperately in need of jobs during the Depression. Because this is really starting in the 1930s. There were employers who were desperate for anything resembling talent to fill their comic pages up, so they could get them on the stands. And, at first just try to break even, and then see that there was actually quite a bit of profit to make from it. And it was a good match.
Okay. Yeah, because
and then comics started to be respectable, and some of these artists found out that they, some of them learned from some of the better artists that were on staff. So they improved their art, they improved their craft and their form. Some of them, like Siegel and Schuster, thought, we're at a point now where, our character is doing very well, and, we should be in demand, so we're going to demand more money. And the answer was, no, you're not getting more money.
Right.
Like the job.
Yeah. Yeah, I just got finished reading the Superman book by, I think Larry Ty is the author, and it goes at length about that. Of course, there's other ones, about the history of Superman and everything, and all the struggles that Siegel and Schuster had, through the years. Part of it is like they did sign a pretty crummy deal, but they probably were desperate at the time, and looking back on it, maybe they would have negotiated a little bit better, but they were kids basically, so who knows, but it seemed like it came out right in the end, although it took a long time, unfortunately, for them. But did you find that a lot? Is that people were mistreated in the industry, or did that just not happen? These are just isolated incidents.
I think it depended who you were and where you ended up.
Mm-hmm.
I think Eisner and Iger treated their talent fairly, and part of that might be because Eisner, who was also not just one of the co-owners, but who was also an artist himself, he appreciated what the other artists were going through and wanted to see that they got a fair deal.
Mm-hmm.
And Kirby was one of the ones that came through the Eisner Studios.
Mm-hmm.
Some other big names too. I think Lou Fine came through the studios.
I believe so, yeah. And I can't think of others off the top of my head, but quite a few did kind of come through their doors and things like that. And what else was I going to ask you? Just is there anything else that you're kind of looking for the future? I mean, what are your goals now? I mean, it sounds like, you've done the shows, you've had the books. I mean, are there more books on the horizon, more shows on the horizon, more guest speakers? What is coming up for you?
Besides the panel next week, I don't really have any long-term plans. I'm going to keep trying to keep an eye out for what's coming up in the comic shops. What interesting Jewish content's going to be for sale, and trying to promote it as best as I can. Right now, the easiest way for me to promote stuff is through Facebook, which isn't maybe the best way, but at least my contacts and learn about it through me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm especially trying to keep an eye out for Canadian Jewish content, because that seems to be oddly enough an area where there hasn't been that much, and it's coming through. It's coming onto the market slowly, it seems, compared to other kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that we don't have comics publishing in Canada. We've got our biggest publisher is probably Drawn and Quarterly, and they do well on both sides of the border, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly do well in Canada. We've got, I think, 9 other smaller publishers just doing comics and graphic novels.
Mm-hmm.
There's some book publishers that occasionally will come out with a graphic novel which might or might not have Jewish content.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing with Drawn and Quarterly is a lot of the Jewish content books they come out with, they're not necessarily by Canadians, and they're not necessarily having Canadian Jewish content.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book they did by Guy Delisle, a travelogue called Jerusalem Chronicles from the Holy Land, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great book. I was glad it was out and I read it, but he himself isn't Jewish, so. Why they aren't also publishing a travelogue by a Canadian Jew who's gone to Israel? I don't know. Maybe they haven't presented themselves the idea to Drawn Quarterly. Maybe Drawn Quarterly rejected it.
Now this may seem a silly question, but I'll ask it because
Sure.
Is the Jewish experience different for a Canadian than someone from the United States, or is it very similar?
I'm not the best qualified to answer that, but I would certainly say yes. From my own personal experience and from books I've read, there are differences, but of course there's going to be similarities too.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked a bit about this in the introduction to the first volume of the Jewish Comics Anthology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you're on a border town, and Toronto's pretty close to the Buffalo border,
Mm-hmm.
at least in terms of the airwaves. So, they have access to some of, before the days of cable and the internet, they had access to some of our shows. We had access to some of their shows. There are people in Toronto who would go across to Buffalo to do shopping, and people from Buffalo to Toronto. So, you have that, cross-pollination of American Jewish and Canadian Jewish and American and Canadian ideas. But things are different growing up in Canada. One thing is, like I said, with the comics industry, we don't have that history. We don't seem to have that history of Canadian Jews getting involved in the comic industry. If they were there, it's not that well known. And the Canadian comics industry itself is not that well known here as the American industry is. We don't have as many scholars working on that.
Right.
To bring out the history. So. And there are differences in attitude, with our legislation sometimes being different.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Texas for 2.5 years, and it's a transition going from a place where I don't know anyone who owns a gun to a place where it seems like everybody has a gun.
I bet. Wow. So you have lived in the United States. So
you're stopped at a traffic light, and it's not uncommon to see a pickup truck beside you, and they've got a rifle in the back.
Wow. Well, that's even different from here. I mean, I'm sure there's people here in Oregon where I am, and even in California, but Texas is like its own thing, compared to those locations. But I get it. So
there's a difference between living in a small state,
mm-hmm.
where you don't have to drive too far in any direction to get to the next state. And someplace like California, which I think California is about the size of a lot of our provinces,
right?
Where you can just drive north for.
Oh yeah, you could drive for 13 hours north, and you'd still be in California. So if you're going from San Diego up, so yeah. So. Yeah.
And a lot of our provinces are big like that,
mm-hmm.
and it's. I've heard about how different it is to live in Winnipeg than it is in Toronto, because you're so far from a major city. At least in Toronto, we can drive to Hamilton, you can drive to Guelph,
mm-hmm.
or the other way, it's only a 3-hour drive from Kingston.
Yeah.
But some of the other cities are so remote, and it affects your culture when it's so insular.
Mm-hmm. So one of these days I'm going to have to make it up there. I mean, it's like I'm only 5 hours away. I've been to Seattle, but I didn't have my passport, and I was just thinking, the way things are nowadays, I crossed over the line, and it's like, oh, you can't come back without this, that, and the other. And I was like, oh, so but one of these days I'll get up to Canada to visit a few places, so. But.
And as far as comics goes, though, Toronto's an interesting, Toronto and Canada, it's an interesting place to live. Toronto's the home of the Beguiling, which is a world-renowned comic shop, which sells a lot of alternative and small press, but also sells mainstream comics.
Mm-hmm.
It's managed to stay in business for got to be at least 20 years,
mm-hmm.
probably older than that. We also have Silver Snail, which is a long-running comic shop.
Mm.
But this is the home of Prisoners of Gravity, which if you've ever seen on YouTube, it's kind of a groundbreaking sci-fi and comics popular culture show.
Okay.
It was unfortunately short-lived, but they at a time when their names were not as big as they are now, they were managing to get interviews with Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore and all the greats of Canadian and American sci-fi and comics. And top, they'd get these themed episodes where they'd have just one episode talking about how women are represented in comics, or about autobiographical comics, and it was interesting to be here in the city where that was being produced. And the producer of that show, Mark Asquith, went on to do other great things in sci-fi and pop culture. And we've got the Toronto Comic Art Festival, which is, I've been to Mocha Fest, and I think it's just as great a show as Mocha. Mm-hmm. In my opinion.
Yeah. I think I've heard of that, so it sounds like it's pretty good up there. So we're getting near the end of the show here, and I always let everybody, even though we plugged a few things during the show, but if people want to get in contact with you, or they want to see books or see your website, how do they get in touch with you? How do they order your books? And where will they see you next?
To get in touch with me, probably best through the blog. I think there's, if they want to send an email, I believe I still have an email link on the blog, which is jewishcomics.blogspot.com. Mm-hmm. To get a copy of Jewish Comics Anthology, if you just use the website jewishcomicsanthology.com, it'll direct you to the page where you can order, I think, both volumes. Or at least from there you can email the publisher and ask how to get a copy. Volume 2 is available at Amazon.com. I believe we're trying to get Volume 1 published as a trade paperback, cheaper than the hardcover was. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure where we are in that yet. And Volume 2 and hopefully Volume 1 too, as well soon will be on Comixology if you prefer the digital version.
Cool. Okay. And any upcoming appearances, or you said you really didn't have anything planned at this time?
Well, my next appearance will be at the panel next Saturday.
Okay, but beyond that, nothing later this summer or anything like that, or next, fall or something like that, to your knowledge?
I'm planning to make an appearance at a comic studies conference at Ryerson University here in Toronto.
Okay.
I don't know if my presentation idea is going to be accepted yet or not. So we're past the deadline. I haven't heard back from them yet. But,
okay.
Even if I'm not presenting, I think I'll go there just to hang out with comic scholars and see what they're going to be presenting on. It's the theme this year is political comics and graphic novels. So
okay.
That interests me.
Oh, very good. I'm
on Facebook. If somebody looks up Steve Bergson Toronto, something like that, I think it'll show up easily enough.
Okay. Well, I found your website, but of course you gave me a link, so it's like I found your Facebook and everything. So, but if anybody can't find it through normal means, drop me a line, and then I can put you in touch with Steve. But anyway, I appreciate you being on the show today, and I want to thank you very much. And anything else? Any final words you'd like to say?
Keep reading great comics.
All right. Thank you for listening, and thank you again, Steve Bergson, for being my special guest. Episode number 33 will be coming soon. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. Become a patron of Fun Ideas Productions, and if everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. This has been the Fun Ideas Podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2019 Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you very much, and have a good night.